Hello, this is our 10th look at the Gospel of Mark, asking the question, who is Jesus? And particularly in these last chapters, examining more closely why Jesus came to earth. So our study today will cover Mark chapters 12 and 13. So please pause the video for now and read these two chapters, please. So we've come to the last week in the life of Jesus. Jesus is in Jerusalem with his disciples. He's just received an amazing royal welcome into the family. Into the city, shouting hosannas, proclaiming him as the Son of David, the coming King. And so the disciples and the crowds believe that Jesus is coming to Jerusalem to become the King of the Jews and to establish the long promised kingdom of God. The religious leaders, on the other hand, they want to get rid of Jesus. They're fearing that Jesus will start a revolt with Rome, which will take away their authority and their prosperity. And of course, Jesus, in a totally opposite direction, is predicting that three times, actually, just in the last couple of chapters, that he's going to be delivered to the chief priests and to the scribes and to the Pharisees, that he will be mocked and spit on and flogged and killed and then rise again on the third day. So our first chapter today will find the opposition to Jesus is growing, and eventually this is what will lead to his death. And then in the second chapter, we will see Jesus pronouncing God's coming judgment on Israel and its leaders. He's done some of that already, and he'll continue to do that in chapter 13. As we begin chapter 12 today, it's Tuesday in the last week of the life of Jesus. On Friday of this week, Jesus will be crucified. Chapter 12 begins with a parable which Jesus tells against the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. This is the same group that questioned the authority of Jesus at the end of chapter 11. So they're still interacting together at the beginning of chapter 12. This parable is another condemnation of both the leaders of Israel and the nation of Israel. This parable, along with the cursing of the fig tree and then the judgment that Jesus predicts in chapter 13, all culminate together to declare to Israel that God has done with them and is going to send his judgment upon them for their disobedience against God's commands. This condemnation that Jesus is bringing also is another reason why the leaders want to get rid of Jesus. They won't believe him. They do not want to listen to his exhortations, and so they just want to get rid of him. The parable that Jesus tells is about a planted vineyard with a fence and a tower. And this vineyard is leased out to the tenants with the expectation of payment from the fruit of this vineyard. When the owner sends servants to receive the payment from the tenants, they beat them, they shamefully treat them, they even kill some as they send the others away. Finally, the owner sends his own son to collect the payment, and they kill him with the desire to take possession of the vineyard for themselves. The parable goes on to tell us that the owner of the vineyard then comes and destroys the tenants and gives the vineyard to others in their place. In this parable, the servants sent to receive the payments really represent the Old Testament prophets, which came again and again to receive what Israel was to give to the Lord in obedience, and to pronounce on them God's judgment if they did not. And then the owner's son in the parable, of course, is Jesus. And of course, he's killed, as he's predicted that he will be. And then finally, with the taking away of this vineyard from the tenants, is really another prophecy of the coming judgment upon Jerusalem and the temple, which occurred in 70 AD. And of course, then the Gentiles were brought into the people of God through the church, which is formed at Pentecost. And so we have a whole new people of God raised up to replace the nation of Israel. So, important parable. We're told in verse 12 that the Jewish leaders knew that Jesus had told this parable against them, and they were seeking to arrest Jesus, but they were afraid of the people. Chapter 12 continues with three more encounters mentioned between the Pharisees and the Herodians and the Sadducees and the scribes with Jesus about taxes, the resurrection, and God's commandments. These encounters are really attempts, and it says right in the verses, they're attempts to trap Jesus into saying something in which they can accuse him of being a false teacher and arrest him and put him away, as it were, from the crowds. Verse 34 of chapter 12 says this, after these three encounters with these religious leaders in trying to entrap Jesus. It says, and after that, because of the wisdom of Jesus, and after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. Their attempts only showed their own lack of belief in God, their own foolishness, and God's wisdom through Jesus Christ. And so they stopped asking questions from Jesus. They're going to take a more determined position to actually try to kill him. Chapter 12 closes with Jesus demonstrating from Psalm 110 verse 1, Psalm 110 verse 1, that the Son of David is more than just David's human descendant. The people believed that the Messiah, which would be the Son of God, would be no more than a human descendant from David. And so using this psalm, Psalm 110 verse 1, a psalm that's heavily quoted in the New Testament, Jesus shows them that the Messiah is not only a human descendant from David, but also the Son of God, showing again that Jesus is the Son of Man and the Son of God. Jesus goes on to point out the hypocrisy of the scribes. They appear as righteous men. They walk around in long robes. They do long public prayers. They have the best seats in the synagogue. They are honored at feasts. And yet Jesus says their religion robs widows and is very hypocritical in practice, and warns the people not to follow such hypocritical leaders. Mark chapter 12 ends with an example of a poor widow. She only has a penny to put into the treasury. And she's an example, after this exhortation against the scribes, of how little the religious leaders are caring for the widows under their care, and actually taking advantage of them, of their poverty, and making them even more poor. And yet this widow is also an example of someone who truly, wholeheartedly believes in God and wants to submit to him and honor him. A real contrast to the religious leaders that we have seen so far. Mark 13, the whole chapter, is really a prediction of the coming destruction of the temple, which would take place in 70 AD, about 40 years after Jesus made this prediction, when Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the temple to put down a revolt by the Jewish people against Rome's occupation there. History records this event as a brutally ruthless, wholesale devastation and destruction and killing of the people. One of the worst historic events that have taken place in the Holy Land. In this chapter, Jesus predicts not only the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, but also the signs of his second coming, his return to earth. Jesus knows he's going to die and rise again from the dead and ascend to heaven and one day return for a second time. And so he gives in this chapter some signs that the believers at the time are to look for and to see, both with regard to the destruction of the temple, and also the second coming at the end of time on this earth. Jesus ends chapter 13 by saying this: "What I say to you, I say to all, stay awake." In this chapter, Jesus warns many times about false messiahs coming and people following them and being misled and misguided, and thinking that he is the Messiah, but really the Messiah has not come and will come at the end of this age. So as we end today's lesson, we find the disciples and the people looking for Jesus to be their king and to establish the kingdom of God. We find the scribes and the Pharisees and the Herodians and the elders conspiring together to kill Jesus. As early as chapter 3, verse 6, we read, "The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him how to destroy Jesus." And again in 11:18, which is just after this royal entry into Jerusalem, where the people are proclaiming Jesus as the king, the Messiah, the one who is coming to establish the kingdom. Immediately after that, we read, "And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching." So the disciples and the crowd believe that he's coming to establish the kingdom. The Pharisees and the religious leaders, the scribes, the Herodians, the elders want to kill Jesus. And then Jesus himself is predicting that he will be killed and rise again the third day. Finally, Jesus warns of God's impending judgment upon the nation of Israel for their disobedience. So who is Jesus? Well, in his explanation of Psalm 110, verse 1, Jesus himself teaches that he's not only the Messiah, the son of David, but he is also the Son of God. And Mark has proved many times over in the earlier chapters that Jesus is the Son of God. We find Jesus predicting his return when the world comes to an end, knowing that he will raise from the dead and be ascended into heaven, and then return with power with the angels in heaven to finally set up this promised eternal kingdom. In spite of the disciples and the people thinking that Jesus is going to be made king, Jesus again is predicting that he's going to be killed by the religious leaders so that he might become a ransom for many and then rise the third day. The reason Jesus has come to earth, the culmination of all of his ministry, is to be a ransom, a payment for sin. And to be a ransom, Jesus must die as a guilt offering, as a sacrifice for sin. At this time, Jesus is not going to deliver the people of Israel from the political and economic and national bondage that they're in under Rome, which they think is of the utmost importance for them. Jesus is going to bring them freedom from guilt and the bondage of sin, which is their greatest need before a holy God. And you know what? That is our greatest need before a holy God as well. To be delivered from the guilt and the bondage and the power of sin. And for that, Jesus must become a ransom. Well, for next week, as we approach the end of the book of Mark, I want to ask you to read chapters 14 and 15. And then after next week's, we'll have a final chapter on Mark 16 and Acts chapter 1 to finish off our look at Mark and who is Jesus and why has Jesus come. Thank you for listening. God bless you. Bye for now.